Hello, welcome to another MeshBaker tutorial. MeshBaker is an asset for Unity 3D that combines textures together into atlases and many meshes together into a single mesh. The reason you want to do that is because it saves draw calls and improves performance. This tutorial is about tiling textures and how to get those into your atlases. Tiling is notoriously difficult for combining with atlases. This is an intermediate tutorial. For basic usage, I would recommend look at the link in the description to the other tutorials and start with the basic tutorials. Okay, so let's get started. We'll talk about briefly about atlases and why tiling is difficult, and then later on I'll talk about solutions, how you can handle tiling in your combined meshes. So let's look at this simple scene. I've got some low poly houses here. Each of these houses is composed of 5 meshes, so that the chimney, foundation, door, roof walls, etc. Each of these uses its own texture. So as you can see, the door, that's the texture for the door. There's the texture for the roof. There's the texture for the foundation and the chimney. So if we want to combine these meshes, these textures have to be combined into an atlas. So an atlas looks like this. There, this part over here. So you can see it's a single image. The door is on one side. The brick. There's the brick texture, there's the roof texture, and there's the tiny little texture used by the walls down here. So let's actually delete this out. That was from a trial run I did. So let's try to combine these and see what happens. So game object, create other. I'm going to create a new mesh and material baker. That's usually the first thing we do in any scene. Let's add some objects. So it's gonna add 5 objects. Grab the low poly house, drag in the chimney, door, foundation, roof, walls. And I'm not going to do the window because it's got a reflective texture, so it won't combine well, but everything else is diffuse, so they'll combine fairly well. So then we create our empty assets for combined materials. Experiment. Let's just do test 1. And then bake materials into combined material. Yeah. So let's try that. There we go. And now we can bake the meshes together. And let's look at what we got. So I select the combined mesh in my scene, drag it over, and ooh! So this is the problem with tiling textures. So let's take a look at the atlas that was created. So this was the atlas that MeshBaker just created. First thing you might notice is all this wasted space. That's because MeshBaker is trying to use a power of 2 texture, and when it combined all these textures together, it was just a little bigger than 1024, so it had to make the whole thing 2048 by 2048. So there's something we can do to help with that, and that's in the material baker settings. We can go resize power of 2 textures. So what this will do is it'll shrink these textures by a pixel, and because these are one of the reasons these are getting bumped out is the padding between the textures is making this block slightly larger than 1024. So that should help a lot. So I can rebake that, bake materials into combined materials. But the second thing you probably noticed is these big black areas, and what's happening is due to the method of tiling that has been used, this part of the mesh is picking up adjacent textures. Okay, I'm going to rebake that because the atlas changed, which explains why that changed. So why does this mesh look so strange? I'm going to explain that, and it has to do with the tiling, obviously. Before I do that, I'm going to show you a very important feature of MeshBaker. If you end up with a result like this, I strongly recommend go to the console, look back through, and one of the messages will be a message that looks like this: says there are possible problems with the meshes that prevent them from combining well. Treatment suggestions. So if you look here, it'll tell you what objects are causing problems. So the object chimney uses UVs outside the range 0, 1, create tiling that tiles this box. This problem, blah, 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 blah. It'll pick up things, and then there's a couple of treatment suggestions. So then the foundation has also been identified, and the roof has also been identified as meshes that can cause this problem. And the treatment suggestions are there. So this is a feature well worth paying attention to. So what is happening here? Well, there are two ways that textures can be tiled in Unity. One is using the texture property settings in Unity. The other is using UVs outside the range 0, 0, 1, 1 when creating a model. So the first way is used by the grass plane here. If we look at the texture settings, they're tiled by 4 times by 4 times the bump map. So that's one way that tiling can be created. The other way is what's being used by the roof here and the foundation. So if I look at the UV layout, this is the modeling program where I created the mesh. So here is the image, and you can see that some of the UVs are outside of the image bounds. So what happens in that case is the image is tiled virtually in all directions by the graphics card, and when this point gets sampled, it samples the pixels on that little virtual tile that was created in the correct position. So it's as if the out of bounds UVs are treated as if the underlying image was tiled infinitely in all directions. Now that obviously creates a problem in our atlas, because this texture here or these out of bounds UVs are sampling over here and over here in the black and on the door and on the roof, and picking up parts of the atlas that we don't want to be picked up. So how do we deal with, or what are the solutions for this problem? There's basically boils down to 2, although I've got 3 options here. One is we can bake the tiling into the atlas. So basically we can tile this image enough times to accommodate those out of bounds UVs, and then scale that down and squeeze it into the atlas. The other is we can combine just like with like. So we could combine the foundation and the chimney together. And the final option is actually the same as that one, but we can do that and bake it into a submesh so that this still remains as one mesh. So let's look at those options. So to bake the tiling, for an object that uses, like the plane, that uses these options, it'll automatically, our MeshBaker will automatically bake the tiling for those when the meshes are added. For meshes that use out of bounds UVs, MeshBaker, you have to click this setting, fix out of bounds UVs. So I click that on, bake materials into combined material. Now we're going to get a much bigger atlas, because those brick textures and the roof texture are going to be tiled and then added to the atlas. So let's give this a moment. There we go. We have to rebake the mesh. So now it's looking almost the same, although this is a little blurry. I'll explain that in a moment. So if we look at the atlas, so you can see what's happened. This brick texture is much bigger because it's been tiled a bunch of times and then added to the atlas. Same thing with the roof texture. And there's actually 2 copies of the brick texture, one for the chimney and one for the foundation, and that's because these use different tilings. So the big disadvantage of this feature is that it creates very large atlases and uses a lot of space in your atlases. And you can imagine it's very easy to have things that are tiled hundreds or thousands of times, and then would create ridiculously huge atlases very easily. And that's why we're getting this blurring here, because when this was tiled a whole bunch of times and scaled down to fit in this box in the atlas, we lost some resolution. So we can help a little bit with that by there's this setting max tiling bake size, so it's being limited to 1024, so we can make that to 2048. Bake materials into combined material, and that'll help somewhat lately. Notice the chimney is done much better, and that's because it didn't go out of bounds very much. If we look at the UV map for the chimney, notice that it almost is completely in bounds. There's just this little bit at the bottom that goes out of bounds, so the tiling only just added a little bit of extra texture. To fix that, we have to rebake our mesh. And yeah, so it's looking a little better, but this foundation still doesn't look great. So what are our other options? Well, the other solutions are combine like with like. So we could combine the chimney and the brick together into one combined mesh, and we can combine the rest of the house together into another combined mesh. So let's do that. I'm actually going to duplicate the mesh baker. Control D. So we've got two mesh bakers in the scene, and that's going to create some interesting effects, but I'll show you how to deal with them. The first thing is these are currently sharing the same material bake result. Obviously this duplicate, let's give it a different name, we'll call it chimney, needs its own. So let's create assets for combined material, experiment, we'll call it test 3. And the chimney is only going to use these 3. The easiest way to do that is just set that down to 2 and drag the chimney and the foundation here. And then I can go to the other material baker, and I think if I go shift delete, that wasn't right, control Z, chimney. Okay, yeah, if you hold down shift and press delete, then it eliminates a thing out of a list. So now I'm down to 3 objects there. So I can bake those together. Okay, and then I go down to the mesh baker and I bake it. Okay, so that is actually looking pretty good. Let's actually have a look at our atlas. Which one was this one using? Test 1. So test 1 mat. Okay, now one option you might want to consider is turning off the force power of 2 atlas. And the reason you might want to turn that off is because it will make a smaller atlas, but it's a non-power of 2 atlas. And so Unity will actually, behind the scenes, usually scale your non-power of 2 atlas to a power of 2 when it builds the project. So you don't actually save anything by using the non-power of 2 atlas. But sometimes it feels better to have an atlas that fits the box more nicely. So then this mesh baker chimney, we can bake its materials together. And why is it still doing this copying and scaling? It's because I've actually still got that out of bounds UVs checked. So even though both of these objects, the chimney and the foundation, use the same material, it's copying that. So I have to uncheck that and then rebake it. And now it should go really fast because if we look at the atlas is still there in the asset, but if we actually look at the material, we'll notice that it's simply reusing the original texture that was added. And now if we bake those meshes together, this is actually going to do something interesting. Those look great, but why did the other mesh disappear? Well, the reason the other mesh disappeared is because I copied this mesh baker, and they're using the combined mesh object. They both reference this same combined mesh object, so they're sharing that combined mesh object. So I need to give this new mesh baker its own combined mesh object. I wouldn't have had to do this if I created a brand new mesh baker. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. I meant to, let's put this back out here, there. I meant to drag that into this slot. So now it's got its own combined mesh object, so I can bake that, and I should be able to rebake the other one. Let's have a look at this. Okay, so what is going on now? So what's happening is these are using different combined mesh objects, but they're actually sharing the same mesh. So this other field in the mesh baker, this says mesh -67 blah 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 blah. That's the instance ID, and those are actually the exact same mesh internally. So when I bake one, it overwrites the mesh of the other. So I have to force these to use different ones. So if I set one of them to none and then rebake it, there, none, and then rebake the mesh baker, there, finally. Okay, so we've got there. So this actually looks pretty much, except we don't have the window, but because we didn't combine that exactly like the original mesh. So the bricks have been combined, and the rest of those meshes have been combined. So we've done the bake the tiling. We've combined like with like, and then we can map the tile objects to their own submesh. So yeah, actually before I do this, so in this scene, a good strategy would be to combine all of the houses, the roof, door, and walls for all three houses together into one combined mesh, and all the brick parts, the foundation of the three houses and the chimneys of the three houses all together into another combined mesh. So that would be a good strategy. Now we've ended up with 2 combined meshes and 2 mesh bakers. So is there a way to do this where we just the houses are still one object? And yes, we can do it using multiple materials. So this is a little bit complicated. You should know there's no performance benefit to using method 3 over method 2. They're basically equivalent, but you do end up with 1 mesh instead of 2 mesh, which can be a little nicer to deal with. So let's try and quickly set this up. So I'm going to delete this. I'm going to go back to my material baker. I'm going to add in the chimney and the brick. So we need this to be 5. I'm going to add the chimney and the foundation. And then what I have to do is I have to click this multiple combined materials, and then I need to build mappings. So what I'm going to do, the easiest way to do this is to build source to combine mappings from objects to be combined. And so what it's done is it's created one object or one mapping, and it's mapping the door material, roof material, walls material, and brick material to this material. We actually don't want that. We want to create a second mapping, and we're going to map the brick to its own layer. So to do this, I click plus, so I create a second mapping. We're going to give it its own material, so I could just go out and duplicate one of these. Go back to the Mesh Baker. So it's got its own target material, and let's set that to just 1 and drag the brick material in there, and then I'm going to shift delete. You have to press it twice for some reason to get rid of that material. So now I'm mapping the brick to this, and that'll have its own submesh, and all the walls to this, and it'll have its own submesh. So let's bake materials into combined material. So it does this little trick, or this baking. So we're going to end up with 2 atlases, and when I bake the mesh together, we're going to have 1 combined mesh with 2 materials on it. One being the brick, and the other being the atlas material that has everything being combined. And then we go to the baker and bake. There. So now why is that? Oh, yes. Okay, so we've still got the fix out of bounds UVs checked. So we're actually going to have to create a third. If I want the brick to behave nicely, I'm going to have to create a third mapping because the roof was tiled as well. So let's go plus. Let's duplicate that. Go back to our mesh baker, give it another combined material. Is that, oops. Scroll on me. Okay, you're not going to scroll. So let's scroll this down. It's hard to keep track of these. Source materials is going to be the roof. These are kind of tedious to do, and then I'm going to take the roof out of there. Shift delete and delete, and we have unchecked the fix out of bounds UVs, and now I can bake the materials into combined. So actually we're not going to save much at all. The only materials that are going to be combined are the meshes that are going to end up being combined are the door and the wall, and the roof and the brick are going to end up on their own sub mesh. And okay, and then we have to bake the baker, and so we do end up with a mesh that looks exactly like the original, and it's 1 combined mesh object. But notice it's got 3 materials, and so we've got 3 draw calls instead of 5 draw calls. So we haven't saved a lot by using that approach. However, we do have 1 mesh instead of 2 or 3 meshes. Okay, so that shows you how to you can handle tiling meshes in with Mesh Baker. The next video I'm going to hopefully get out over the next week or so. We'll talk about more about this multiple material feature, how to handle multiple materials and tiling meshes. Anyway, thank you for your time, and Mesh Baker is available in the Unity Asset Store. And there's a free version which handles just diffuse and bump diffuse, so you can experiment with it if you before buying. Anyway, email me if you have any questions.